And I believe we're live. Thank you all for joining us for the second part of our panel discussion, Breaking the Mold in Model Minority. These sessions have been a reflection on the violence and hate perpetrated toward our Asian community during this immensely difficult time of going through a global pandemic. But between these two sessions, we've experienced the most regretful of these heinous crimes, coming in the loss of 8 lives from last Tuesday's shootings at the hands of 21-year-old Robert Aaron Long in Atlanta, and 6 of them being Asian women. And all of these women were mothers and grandmothers, hard-working immigrants to provide a better life for their loved ones. And their deaths have left us in deep, deep mourning and sadness. I find it paramount that we say their names out loud, to embody their spirits and really personalize the remembrance, as I really believe that this is the first step which all of us need to take for this healing to begin. The names of the 8 victims are 33-year-old Delana Ashley Yan, 54-year-old Paul Andre Michaels, 44-year-old Dao Yu Feng, 49-year-old Xiaoji Tan, 74-year-old Sun Chung Park, 51-year-old Hyunjung Grant, 69-year-old Sun Cha Kim, and 63-year-old Young-ae Yu. We're all completely devastated and mourn their passing. We wish their families all of our sympathies and condolences, and words can't really describe the emotions so many of us have felt this past week. I mean, it's everything about that is, I don't know what to say actually. Before we begin, I just wanted to I wanted to mention and not forget that the other underrepresented Asian minorities in music as well for these conversations, the Vietnamese Americans, the Cambodian Americans, the Malaysians, the Indians, the Thai, the Pakistani. However, to reflect the current representation of the Asian demographics of the NEC community, these conversations will concentrate on the experiences of the Chinese, Korean, and Japanese nationalities, and I ask for your understanding from the underrepresented Asian alumni and those members in our NEC community. There is a function on the link that you're watching to ask questions in the chat box, so if you do feel the desire to ask questions, please type them in after 8 p.m. since this discussion will go until 8:30, and we'll try to address a few of them as I will get them in a text form, and we'll try to answer them if there are questions. So just wanted to address that. So here we are, second part of the discussion. My name is Jae Cosmos Lee. I am a violinist, founding member of A Far Cry, and concertmaster of Cape Symphony in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. I first came to the United States when I was 3 years old. My father was doing his PhD at the University of Iowa, of all places. Spent 4 years there as he graduated, and then went back to Korea and spent another 6 years from 7 to 13, and then finally immigrated to Michigan, Ohio and Michigan, at the age of 13 in 1989. I'm a naturalized citizen, and I experienced both being an American and being a native Asian at the same time. And I wanted to culminate this second panel discussion with people who have their feet well in 2 different cultures and who have been here and the experiences they have gone through as a native Asian. So I wanted to introduce Mai Motobuchi, who actually needs no introduction to this community, as she is a distinguished member of NEC's viola and chamber music faculty and has been a member of the Borromeo Quartet for over 20 years. She also teaches at her alma mater, Tenrikyo Institute of Music in Tenri, Japan. Mai was born in Japan and now is a naturalized citizen of the United States.
No, I'm still a Japanese
Oh,
citizen.
you're still Japanese. Even better. And she came to the United States first to study in the 1990s, first in Michigan, and then in Texas. Welcome, Mai, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we have composer Lei Liang, who is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and last year's winner of the coveted Grawemeyer Award for Composition. He currently serves as Distinguished Professor of Music and Composition at University of California in San Diego. Lei is an alumnus of NEC, acquiring his bachelor's and master's degree in 1996 and 1998, respectively, and then going on to earn his PhD at Harvard after that. He is a naturalized citizen of the United States, but first having come to the US as a teenager in 1990, right after the Tiananmen Square protests in Beijing. Welcome, Lei. Thank you so much for joining us.
We're glad to be here, Jae.
And our last panelist is Korean violinist Hyunji Chung, who earned her graduate diploma at NEC in 2016 and has recently been awarded her DMA from Boston University in January of this year. Congratulations. She is a prize-winning performer and a dedicated educator who was born in Seoul, Korea, and is currently a Korean citizen. Is that correct? Yes. And first coming over to the US to study at the Peabody Conservatory with Suvin Kim in 2012. And thank you, Hyunji, for joining me in this panel discussion.
Thank you for having me, Jae.
I found it crucial that in order to have a deeper, meaningful discourse in these discussions, that assembling a team of panelists that cross the generational lines and different backgrounds and times they have assimilated into the American culture was very important. Starting with you, Mai, can you tell us a little bit about how you first came to the United States as a student and
Yes.
what your first impressions were?
Yeah. Well, I was a senior in high school in 1992. And I was supposed to finish my high school, which I was about to finish. And I was going to university there in Japan because I wanted to switch. I was a violinist up to the point, and I really wanted to switch to the viola. And to study with the viola, I needed education to switch to the viola from the violist. But at the time in 1992, there wasn't any viola teacher in Japan. There were viola teachers who were violinists and who taught viola at the universities, but not so many that I could find. And of course, my role model, Nobuko Imai, was in Germany, so I couldn't really study with her either in Japan. And I was kind of agonizing what to do. But then there was a very rare chance of one person who could get to go study in the United States for the summer course. And I was lucky enough to sort of hit that chance, and I came, and I had one violin and one viola in my hands, and I took lessons. And my teachers, on the second or third lessons, my teacher said, if you really want to study, that you should be here. You should really have this opportunity, and we will, take care of you, like scholarships and everything. So you should really be here to study. And I was so moved by that. And I went home and convinced my parents, and I was here 6 weeks later. And I kind of left the high school, left everything behind, and my parents still cries about it that day I left because I was a baby of the family. But then I never regretted ever since of making that big decision.
Yeah. Was it difficult to learn the language and
Oh yes,
assimilate
yes,
the culture?
right.
Talk a little
Because
bit
in the high school, you needed to graduate with the high enough grade in the U.S. government and the U.S. history. And I had nothing to do with that. And I only had 8 months to finish the course, and I didn't even know who Washington was. So, and I didn't even, know any word of English. And I was very lucky that my host family who took me in as their daughter, and they really dedicated their life to teach me from beginning. And they were studying with me and studying Japanese so that they could, talk to me a little bit. And the little sisters that I raised with in the family, they taught me how to say a dog and, all these little things. But my parents, my American parents, father was African American and mother was Caucasian American. So from the beginning of being here, they taught me everything, the foundation of the racisms and the differences that we embrace. And I've never, was encountered with any sort of racism at that by that point, because I was, majority in Japan, and we were just Japanese around us, and I've never thought of myself as a minority or people with a color until the point that I came here. And I was so shocked to see where in a way, in the social stand, I was supposed to be considered. And also my classmates in the English courses in the high school was a lot of Vietnamese kids. And people openly called them boat people, and I had no idea what that meant really at that moment. They were just my classmate who also didn't speak English. And later on, more and more we could communicate with the language. We got to know how and why they came over. And I remember feeling very lucky to have had a choice to choose to be here, and had amazing supportive group of people who supported me for being here. So that was my experience of being here at the very beginning in '90s.
Okay. Wow. I didn't know that your host parents were biracial. And
Yes,
they were, yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
They had a
That's
histories. Yeah, the mother's side didn't even come to their weddings, didn't speak to the daughter until they had a first grandchild.
oh my goodness.
Yeah, so
Okay.
they told me, both sides with love. Yeah.
Right. Fascinating. Lei, tell us, could you tell us about your history and your background and how you first came to the United States? Because I know it sounded like from our conversation yesterday that there was some hardship in actually leaving the country and being here on your own at such a young age. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think now I know that probably we came to America around the same age, Mai and Jay.
Yeah.
I don't know yet about Heejun's story, but yeah, I came as a high school student,
Mm-hmm.
and I was growing up in Beijing, and when I was about 15, we went through, you all know the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, and so I was a high school student and full of idealism. And that event really was life changing for me. Um, and my immediate reaction was that I bonded so much with the citizens in Beijing.
Mm-hmm.
I thought of them as my comrades, and in fact, I got to know so many more people from different walks of life. I was in a bubble, until then, always in a school and surrounded by music. But then, I was able to make a deep connection,
Mm-hmm.
with citizens of Beijing, workers and all of that. And so I was very emotional about my city, so I didn't want to leave.
Yeah.
Uh, but in fact, I would feel a little guilty if I left, because so many of them didn't have the chance to leave the country at that time, including my classmates, right? So I very much wanted to stay, but my parents, just simply because they have gone through the Cultural Revolution when they were uh, at my age, and they lost years and years of their life to that political movement. And so they were just very, very concerned about what I was going to go through. And yes, at that time, we're basically having political lessons every day at school, and we had to make confessions and all of that. So a lot of time was being wasted on that kind of things. And my parents really wanted me to fulfill my potential. And it was this amazing lady who have seen one of my concerts when I was 13 years old. I have a recital of my compositions in Beijing, and she attended a concert. She's a lady from Kentucky, and she's one of those ladies in her 50s or 60s. She was getting her PhD in Austin, Texas. So she reached out to my family after the protest and asked how I was and if there's anything she could do for me. And of course, my parents wanted me to be able to fulfill my potential, and they wanted me to go to get an education in the US. So she was the one who was responsible to bring my cassette tape to a music teacher at UT Austin. And I was able to establish this contact with the professor there, taking free lessons from him on the piano, while I was able to, with her help, find a high school that would take me in. So yeah, I came on my own. I think the story is quite common, how hard it was for all of us. I remember the most difficult assignment as a high school student was US history. Again, like Mai said, I had to produce a paper. It was like a dozen-page long paper, and I barely could read a paragraph of English. So, that kind of hardship, I think, is quite common for people like us. And once I finished that paper, I felt there's nothing I couldn't do. It seemed at the time like an insurmountable thing because of the language barrier. And then 2 years in Austin, then I came to NEC, and we can talk about our NEC experience in a different segment maybe, but
yeah,
that's how I came.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember also having to write a 40-page paper. I mean, this was after having been in the States for 4 or 5 years, but still it was so daunting. I mean, like we had to write a 40-page paper on Hamlet. 40 pages on Hamlet is nearly impossible. Even now, probably. Thank God. Thank God I don't have to do that anymore. Hyunji, tell us about your experience coming to the United States, because I know that your family was here for a little bit in an earlier year as well, right? Correct?
Yeah. So my very first experience in America was in 1999 as a 9-year-old for 1 year in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, when my dad was on sabbatical. And I remember being the only Asian student in my 4th grade class. And I could barely speak English at the time. But I do remember how supportive my teachers were at school and how much I got help from my ESL class. And there were only 2 international students at the time. And I also know that these days in East Chapel Hill, there are more than probably 60-70% of Asian students. I would say that my experience as a 9-year-old in Chapel Hill was mostly positive. I remember there were some minor harmless stereotypes because, kids are always curious. I remember my classmates being really curious about my hair. They would come to me and ask if they can feel my hair. And they also asked me why I don't have as much hair in my body. And they asked me all these questions just out of curiosity. And I remember also there were some rowdy kids being mean to me just because the way I look. But I just thought that because kids just didn't know. They probably never seen as many Asian students before, or maybe never. And then as an adult, but what I'm saying is that my experience was mostly positive, And then even after I got back to Korea, I still really like dreamed about studying in the US. So after I finished my undergrad in Seoul, I moved back to the United States and to start with my old teacher, Suvin Kim, at Peabody Conservatory. So Baltimore was my first city when I moved back in 2012.
Well, as we all know, Baltimore is also a very historically Black city. Um, how did you feel like did you because we all know how there's quite a bit of Asian prejudice towards the Black community even before we actually encounter anyone who is Black because how it's portrayed in the media, how the system is stacked against the Black community here that we don't know. And of course, as a community of people, have us speak Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Thai, or Vietnamese, whatever, we see them as lower class citizens. Um, I mean, did you feel from the get go like coming into a community like that? I mean, did you know that it was it was a dangerous place. I mean, the show The Wire is actually set in Baltimore. I mean, it portrays itself like how it is, I suppose. I mean, there are bad neighborhoods in every city in the United States, but obviously these are stacked against the Black communities for a reason. But how did you feel, and how did you negotiate first coming to this country?
Um, so my first visit to Baltimore was not when I had to audition because my audition process was solely through online.
I see.
Um, so it was the day I moved into my apartment, that was my first day in Baltimore. And so I was mostly excited, but I did hear about the Baltimore back then being one of the most dangerous cities, probably the second most dangerous cities. I was told from friends and my roommates that to not go out after 6 p.m. So I did that for a while. So I would, frankly speaking, I would say that my understanding of race in the US used to be skewed just because I sort of developed this fear just living in Baltimore for 2 years. Um, so, but after many more years living in the US, I was able to make more connections, and really wonderful ones, with people from many different backgrounds, and learn that I shouldn't view or generalize a certain racial group with fear. It's partially because where I grew up, so there's no racial or ethnic diversity. So it was only since when I moved to the US when I start really thinking about the diversity and the importance of it. But yeah, that's my experience in Baltimore.
Right, right. And probably an apt one because so many of us don't have any experience really before coming over to this country what that's going to
That's
feel like.
true.
And not only that, but now with all these different things happening towards the Asian community, I mean, we're probably more scared to go out our doors because we don't want to be perpetrated. And I mean, but it's not something that has just started happening after the pandemic has started, as we all know. I want to ask you, Lei, did you know the struggles of the Asian people in the U.S. from the 19th century, and did you learn while you were in high school, and when like of the struggles of such as the lynching of the Chinese people in L.A. in 1871, which eventually became the Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, did you have ideas about these prejudices against Asian people, or when did you learn about them?
Yeah, so yeah, that was not taught at all when I was in China, right? The history of Chinese immigrants in the U.S. Even though my family actually has, my distant relatives have stories of immigration
Oh, I see.
in the family, but that was not told at all. It was not shared. In fact, most of the things that was being shared is like, the tremendous suffering that people went through in the mainland China part of, that the part of the world, during the Cultural Revolution, for
Hmm.
example, that people tend to, at least during the time I was growing up in the 80s, that was uh, the conversation that tend to take place, because that was so immediate, the suffering. It was only after I left China and through my distant families, my extended families, I start to learn, some of them have settled in California generations ago, and what they went through, and get to know, there are also educational programs and things that I realized, oh my goodness, there is a history of Chinese people here in the U.S. That I was not aware of at all. And then you get to know more, the history of not only the Chinese people but the Japanese people, all of that, and then you start to have a better picture of what people have gone through. These are our ancestors who came here to try to find a better future for their families, and always we know, like, people who start first, they have the highest sacrifice to make.
They have it the toughest.
They have the toughest, yeah, and so those stories are untold at all. When I was growing up in China, then you realize that, yeah, our ancestors actually, they've gone through a lot, that and their stories are not being celebrated in China, and not here, until we become more aware of it, and understanding our connection with these, our own families. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. And in some ways, they are covered up and omitted in the history books. I mean, I didn't see them
Yeah.
in my U.S. history books. They don't tell you. They don't tell you about those. They don't. They don't even talk about the Japanese internment camps
Mhm.
in World War II. And we know that over 100,000 Japanese were sent to a completely different place, out of their houses, out of their separated from their families. I mean, these are the kind of acts that they justified because of fear.
Mhm.
And we know that, I mean, from our last panel discussion, one of our panelists had a father who was born in the imprisonment camp, which just really blows my mind, that just the just the tenacity and the resilience of our people, and still staying and being able to live with dignity and respect, I think is one thing that we all probably share in common. um
Yeah.
Mai, I wanted to ask you, where, I mean, since China, Japan, Korea, especially those three countries, are so closely tied together, um, geographically and also historically, there have been wrongs done by each country in different times in history. Can you can you share with us a little bit about the different prejudices you had against the other Asian countries when you were growing up?
Yes, well, my very first foreign country that I visited was in 1988 for Seoul Olympics, because my sister was an Olympian and she was competing in that Olympic in Seoul.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, so my whole family went. It was my first time ever to get a passport and so on. And
Which
we
which sport?
diving.
Oh my God! Wow.
Yeah, and that's amazing. Like, their whole families are Olympians and stuff, but I can't even swim, and that's the joke of it. But anyway, we went there, and me, innocent me, and I was 14 at the time, had slightest bit of maybe information about the history, but not really from the point. And then I remember how whole family was going through Busan, because it was very interesting way to get to Seoul from Shinkansen to the Kyushu in Japan and take a boat to Bhutan and take the Semao, that train up to
Yes.
Seoul. That's the way that we decided to go to get to know the country better.
Oh,
And it was like,
you didn't just fly.
no, we didn't just fly. We went all the way on the boat. And it was so interesting. And it was just, everything was just so new to me. And that all these people were so nice. And that, me and my sister were talking in the train, and they would give me like a gum, like a lotte gum, and said, here it is. And then we didn't understand each other, but that heartwarming point was really taken, and I was just so impressed. But at the end of the trip in Busan, we were going through the sightseeing site, and we got spitted at by the people there. And we went into the restaurant, and these people would not serve us food because they found out we're Japanese, and that it went on like that. And they decided, and some people said we're Japanese, and they said, oh, you need to go see this park, definitely. So we followed this guy, and it showed us this general defeated Japan. It was the whole mountain of monuments of this general defeated Japan. And that's why he's here, overlooking at Japan with evil eyes, so all people cannot take over us, kind of thing. And as a 14 years old, I was so shocked. I was so shocked we had nothing to do with us. All our family had nothing to do with the army. They didn't even get drafted. And,
Right.
but the three, that I felt so sorry for the wrongdoing from my country, so much so that this many people would feel comfortable to spit at us. And that was the moment I felt that there is the, history that we are to know, that although there was nothing to do with us, that we are to know that there was in the history that they have offended so many layers of people, and that we can't just say that's not us. Because I felt deeply at that moment that I need to make sure in my life that we all include, and this will never happen, at least in my family. And but that was first thing. And the second thing was when I went to China, and then most of the people were very, very nice, but then of course there were people who would tell me, you all people killed my grandparents, kind of story, on and on. And then at that moment, I just would just basically say, I'm so sorry. I just sincerely felt very sorry. And that's a part that we can't forget. It's like it's very easy to say we can't forget when somebody offended you, but it's hard to say we can't forget when you're the one who offended someone. But that's all we can't kind of have to, as a nation, have to apologize, have to really admit that it happened, and have to sincerely apologize human to human. And that's how I feel. But then there were, a lot of people who want to make sure that I know that you did all this wrongdoing, And one of the history class in the U.S. history class in the high school, my teacher was a very smart woman, and she said, instead of doing this class project about the U.S. history, why don't you write and do a presentation on Japanese history and what's so different about what you're learning here? And I did a whole class. It was up to me to do 45 minutes of presentation. I got all the papers gathering around, because one of the things that I was so shocked about was the difference between my high school textbook of Pearl Harbor being 2 lines, and then, Hiroshima, Nagasaki being 25 pages.
Right.
And whereas it was complete opposite here. Pearl Harbor was 25 pages, and Hiroshima, Nagasaki was 2 lines. And, I was thinking that this is how we tell the story to the history, but you need to balance it out.
Absolutely.
What have happened at the Pearl Harbor and what has happened, not as a defensive way, but surely there were mistakes that has happened in both sides, that we need to come together and just say, let's start over again.
Yeah.
And so that when President Obama came to Hiroshima, that was the first president to come to Hiroshima
Right.
since 1945. And the same thing with our prime minister going to Pearl Harbor. And that year gap, I hope that it comes a lot closer, so that we respect as a human. There's no nation,
Right.
there's just human to human respect and where we all came from
Right.
and the way we're going from here.
Not only that, but I mean, if you think about it on a bigger scale now too, I mean, why things are happening the way it's happening to the Asian community here is because everyone's assuming that we're Chinese and the Wuhan virus, you started the Wuhan virus, right? Go back to your country, go back to China. And it doesn't matter if you're from Korea, it doesn't matter if you're from Thailand. And like to a point where even even the shooter, okay, the shooter who's a 21-year-old white man chooses these Asian spas, and in his reasoning that he goes on a rampage because he was ashamed of his sexual desires, so he wants to go there and actually gun down these people who are the object of his desire, so he would actually not have nothing to do with them. But by doing that, not knowing who these people are, it's just places. It's actually, it has no name. It's completely dehumanizing people in a way, just to reduce them down to a color. They're not us. It's the same mentality when someone's punches or knives an elderly person during COVID because they're Asian. I mean, like, how does that? I mean, like, how do we negotiate that? Especially like you're from China. You know what I mean? I mean, like, do you have to apologize for having being Chinese and the virus came it started out in Wuhan? Can you speak to that?
No, I mean, there's absolutely no apology when how virus emerges in a kind of a geographic location that has nothing to do with the race. I mean, that is just a scientific fact that we don't need to debate on that.
Yeah.
But I was listening to what Mai and Jay, what you were saying about human to human, the importance of that. I just wanted to say something about this. I think the experience at NEC, I mean, I got my 2 degrees there and all that. I studied with a wonderful teacher who was an important mentor to me. All of that is, see that on my bios, and we talk about that. But when I thought about my experience at NEC, it was this human to human experience with all my fellow students and
Yes.
faculty members from different backgrounds. That really gave me the real education. You have to know, like, I grew up in the 80s in China, and 80s in China is a very different time from now. At that
Right.
time, Chinese students were the poor students, right? So I remember at NEC, I think I have maybe 2 or 3 other schoolmates from China, because NEC, I mean, most Chinese students couldn't afford to pay tuition to come to use
Right.
to NEC. But there are a lot of Japanese students and Korean students and Taiwanese students. And the thing is, growing up in Beijing, at that time, China was just starting to open, right? And as a high school student, I didn't get to know anyone from Japan or Korea. At that time, it was I just didn't, not even meeting tourists. I probably at conservatories, some lectures, I saw some Caucasian professors who came to visit, but no, I've never spoken to a Japanese or Korean until I came to NEC. It was
Yeah.
at NEC with all those baggages that Mai was describing. How I was taught the history, the tension between Japan and China. I have my version of, how many pages on the Japanese, aggression and how little there was about Hiroshima and all of that, right? So I came with that kind of background. But at NEC, this is a community of immigrants, of people from different countries, including different parts of Asia. And that was my chance to get to know the human story. And that was really important to me because
Mm,
I remember I had friends from China, from Taiwan, like I didn't know much about why there was so much tension between Taiwan and China other than the mainland Chinese version of it. And then I hear their side of the story, and I it was very interesting. I mean, just give you example how complex our cultures can be. A student from Hong Kong, a student from Taiwan, and someone like myself from mainland China, three Chinese people, when we get together, the only language we could use to communicate and understand each other is English. Because the Hong Kong student will speak Cantonese.
right,
We wouldn't understand what he's saying,
right.
right? So our cultures are so diverse. It has their own dialect, it has its own histories and memories. And it was at NEC where I really got to know my fellow students as human, as talented artists with their own histories, their family histories,
Hmm.
their national histories. And then I got to know more about, oh, I see, this is the people uh, who are really the subject that I should get to know, not just a label, not just another box. And I ended up marrying my wife, whom I met at NEC, who's from Japan. So it's I think that side of our educational experience at a school like NEC, where there's the presence of an international body, both faculty and students, is so nourishing and so important. Is probably as important as the degree we get, right now, because that's the place where you get to know people. That's the place you
Absolutely.
get to know their stories.
Yeah. Go ahead, Hyunji.
I might be going back a little bit, but speaking of having biases towards certain racial group, um, I think I would say that for me, growing up born in Seoul, it was very easy for me to pick up biases, especially in a country with no diversity. And again, as a more recent immigrant, I'm just now becoming familiar with many of the past events related to Asian struggles throughout the US history. But especially with the biases towards certain group of people, I mean, after hearing my story, I really feel sick to my stomach that you and your family had to go through it, because even with any kind of severe violence crimes, I just don't believe in responding with the same way with violence and acting out of anger, because that's also part of generalization. And again, there are most people, a lot of people, has nothing to do with it. These crimes and encouraging their anger. I just don't think it's a good way to respond. But at the same time, it is difficult to talk about these events, crimes, when the society community lack of historical account. And oftentimes it's not enough brought up into a conversation. I think in general, like average American homes. So I think that the issue is that even we learn of it, people don't know how to respond adequately. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I remember when my oldest daughter was third grade, and in Japanese school they watched the war movie, and then they came home And then my daughter asked me, what do they mean by enemy's country? Who were they? And, having my daughter, my husband is Jewish American, and my daughter is biracial, but she is American and Japanese. And that having to explain that was one of the most difficult things I had to encounter to do as a parent, and having to explain, neutrally was a kind of very difficult thing to talk about, because in this movie they don't say who the enemies were, who these people were who was bombing, and it's a very difficult place to understand it. And at the same time, I'm also like knowing if I could go back in time in 40s, I would tell all my people that this is not a war that you should be fighting, because I see all this new restaurants and ski clubs and the resort places open in 40s here. They had, it was just a war, it was happening somewhere else. And they had all this, life here, and where they had nothing to eat. My father was raised with 1 grain of rice a day, and they had just, if they see a rainwater, they will just share it to drink that. And it's very lucky that my family survived. But it's also just, they should know how that was just not something that they should have even started to begin with. Whatever the anger they might have had, whatever the aggression they might have had, this was just a complete mistake, in my opinion, and ended up killing their own people, so many of them, and so many others. And it's just, war is never an answer, but it's also something that we need to explain to our kids, because that mistake will never happen again. And that's something that we cannot hide from the past. And as Jae, you were saying about the Japanese internment camp, my whole Tenrikyo church has a big headquarters in Los Angeles. And during that time when everybody had to go to Santa Fe for the internment camp, they were very worried that their church was going to be completely vandalized because of all the hate that it was going around. And guess who came to rescue, to protect their church? It was African American church. Came to them and said, we will make sure your church is safe with us. And that really touched our people. And but they knew what it feels like to be on that shoes. And more and more, us, unfortunately, it's like, if you are ever bullied, you never think of bullying, and it's in the past. If there was a mistake that happened, it really needs to be taught to next generations, so that these are never repeated again. And for that matter, and maybe for me to be sort of letting go of a lot of the things that I was kind of shook me out, like my classmate introduced me as a jab. That's happened once, or that's happened twice, and sort of at first I didn't know how to sort of react to that. And then the third time, for her sake, to not do this again to somebody else, I spoke up to her on the side of that talk and said, it's not really nice to call, as Jap, and it's okay that it happened, but please don't do that again. But by speaking that up, I also felt a little bit sorry that I did that, but at the same time, she would probably never do that again. And there were lots of times when I just laugh it up at some comments, then just let it go. That those laughing part, maybe that's what's causing it to still be here around. That we didn't do anything to protect our kids to be exposed to that. And do we teach them to laugh at it? No, we need to teach them not to have the situation. And this has to change, and that first step is for us to speak up about it and do something about it now.
Totally.
Yeah.
It can't wait because
Yes.
people are dying out there.
Yes.
In the 1960s, the white liberals, they weaponized these experiences of the Japanese internment camps. And by that time, those kids who were born in the internment camps, those kids, those who were actually kids in the internment camps, grew up and they deemed them as success stories. And that's why they called the Asians model minorities. And in reality, they were pitting us against the blacks, the Latinos, the other minorities to say, look at these guys. They're really doing well, but what are you doing? And it's only to undermine each other and not really for advancement as all as a nation. And in this melting pot, it really only does damage. And I just hope that people know that. And I mean, I'm sure you heard that. We've all heard that so many times in our lives. Like, Lay, do you have an example? I mean, I know because you've also worked tirelessly while you were a student, serving people in restaurants and actually, and I'm sure they were like, you're such a hardworking person. Like, what was your experience like? Can you share with us some of your stories?
Yeah, I can share my stories, but I don't want to talk about myself too much. But it's kind of like, yes, when I was at NEC, I was serving tables in restaurants, and it, it was. I might just mention this that I continue to draw a lot of strength from my coworkers
Hmm.
or undocumented workers. You have to know that these are restaurants. I worked at a restaurant for a while between Harbor Square and Central Square, uh, uh, and when I first got there, um, I realized my coworkers were really mean to me. They were calling me names and very impatient with me.
Hmm.
And I grew up in a family who were, music teachers, and we just never had this kind of language in our family. So I was really, really not used to it. But I realized what happened. I realized that I was a student who could speak English, so I was waiting tables. These people who were angry at me a lot, they didn't know how to speak English. They were smuggled here, undocumented, and all they could do is to get very, very little pay, work in the back of the restaurant. They're the invisible Chinese, but
Hmm.
they are the ones who made the food that we ate.
Right.
So I realized I was getting much more tip. And of course, that's unfair to them. So I was a bad waiter. I mean, I gotta admit that. So they could tell that I was clumsy and all that, and I wasn't going to get a career in waiting tables. But I admire people who could do that really well. And I realized these are the people who were being treated unfairly, just in a little community in a restaurant. And then I got to know their stories. We became friends after a while because those who uh, also needed help, I could help them a little bit, and they started to help me. And then we actually became very close friends. And they invited me to their bunker bed apartments in Chinatown and told me their stories. These are some of the most heroic stories I've ever heard,
Hmm.
told by these invisible Chinese. And to this day, I feel like I was inspired by their courage. Some of them had to walk across the border, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, to get here, take a boat, and then rebel against the smugglers on the
Hmm.
boat with their plastic knives. I mean, this is their life, in pursuit of a better future for
Hmm.
themselves. And um, so to this day, I still feel I have uh, learned so much by working together with the undocumented workers. And in fact, I participated in the opera about undocumented workers across US and Mexican border because of my experience working in restaurants, building that rapport with them. Um, but here's something else I can tell you that that my experience, I, 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 I realized that even in academia, we talk about in restaurants and people in internment, as a lot of suffering. But I also went to Harvard, and I saw a lot of discrimination there. When I was a student, for example, uh, I started to compose music that was inspired by Mongolian music, which has always been a really, really important source of inspiration for me since I was a child. I love that music. Uh, it purifies me. It was almost spiritual for me to 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 continue to learn this music and do something about it. Uh, and there was also a Mongolian musician whose music I just fell in love with. It maybe probably like someone falling in love with John Coltrane or something. It's just so great that through recording I fell in love with him. He became my idol, and at that time I was a graduate student at Harvard, and I wanted to do something about Mongolian music. Yet that music is in modal, and it was modal. It was melodic. All of those things that are, shall we say, unpopular for new music.
Right.
A lot of the so-called avant-garde music is getting rid of all these modality and melody and all of these things. So I remember in my conversations with my advisor at that time, oh, he had belittled my heritage so many times in our lessons, and you put it against the European tradition and say basically Mongolian music or all these Chinese music in general has never evolved, but European music evolved through notation or all these things. So basically telling me what I was focusing on was of no value whatsoever.
Right.
Okay, but this music mattered to me. And this musician mattered to me. I mean, I've also at NEC, I look at all these great concerts, have many, many inspiring experiences. So yes, I have my idols in the Western canon as well. But I would say this Mongolian musician saved me when I was a student, because even though I had an advisor who was belittling my own heritage, I didn't feel like I was writing music for my advisor.
Right.
I
Of
was
course
writing
not.
music for the idol in my head, in my mind, that this is the person, even though I didn't speak Mongolian, I never met him, but his music moved me so much that I was writing music almost like a report. I was going to present it to him. And I wanted him to tell me, how was that? Was that good
Right.
enough for you? And I got to tell you, those internal conversations I had with this Mongolian musician spiritually was probably the most powerful. I would say it was my foundation. It helped me to feel like, yes, you got to get this degree at Harvard or something, but there's something even more important than that. It's your true connection with your family, with the heritage, with what you think is beautiful, and that will continue to nurture you. And the story didn't end there. I mean, I did finish my piece in it's a modal piece, and it has almost no new music techniques, the so-called new music extended techniques in it. I just wrote the piece I loved, and the next thing I know, three professors at Harvard, composition professor, told me explicitly, asking me never to write music like that again. And they said, if you continue to work like that, this is exactly what they told me. If you continue to compose music like that, you'll have no future. Stop writing that. Basically, what they're telling me, go write extended technique music, okay? What is cool for new music, for European, centric kind of new music, but don't write Mongolian style music because it has no place here, right? And that's the kind of thing I faced as a student. And you can see the power in here, like how much control they have over you and how they force you to forget your own story and to join them to tell their story using their language, you know. And fortunately, it's almost like a daily prayer I had with the Mongolian musician in my mind that saved me. I didn't feel like I was just looking up to the people who are at positions of power at a prestigious school. That wasn't what I was looking for. I have my own idol. I have my own reference. So that sense of independence actually sustained me and saved me throughout my graduate study years. And guess what? I mean, I continue to write. I still write that music today,
You sure do.
that led me to some of the most beautiful collaborations, most rewarding experience I had. So I could tell my former professors, no, that was not what they told me was wrong.
That is so inspiring, Lei. I know from firsthand experience, you know,
Oh,
having studied Gobi Gloria, which you're,
thank you.
quartet that really invokes, that Mongolian landscape and how beautiful and
Oh, thank you.
out of
Thank
this world this is. I mean, and I think it needs to be said, like, it's not about regurgitating
you.
the same, 12 tones and
Yeah. Oh, Jay, I think you froze a little bit. Uh,
sorry,
oh, there you are. Yeah.
yes. Um, so no, it's just really, it's really inspiring.
Oh, thank you, Jade. I mean, what I wanted to share this, I mean, I assume there's some NEC students here, and you will face this too. You know, in a way, we are somehow, we tend to think that we are how we are treated. You know,
Yeah,
if I'm meeting my professor and he's telling me my heritage is of no value, it never evolved, it's backward and all that. Uh,
right.
Usually when you're at the position as a student, you kind of just accept that's what it is. And then I will try to look for something that will measure up somehow, meet meet their standard and all that. Um, but it's so important for us um, to be defined by the questions we ask, you know, not by how they judge us. And I think just having that connection, be it, a family member or our ancestor that you have a special connection to, um, or artists that you have a special connection who are completely different from the kind of education we receive in this environment, can be such a powerful tool because it makes us more independent, and it makes us face ourselves more honestly, who we are, and not to be
Absolutely.
defined by what they tell us who we are, just define us by who we think we are. And
Yeah,
that is so helpful for me as a student at that time.
right. I'm gonna go with this question, and since we're talking about music, one of the questions that gets asked most often, um, me being a Korean violinist, is, well, if you're Korean, why didn't you study your own music? Why did you study violin? Why did you have to, study Western music and it's not your music, and why, and you spent your life doing it, I mean, so, and you're not really perpetuating your own country's culture, but someone else's. How, and I always tell them, well, music is music. I not only, just because it happens to be the medium that I play in doesn't mean that it's the music that I listen to. But I mean, everyone has a different story. But that's one that always gets asked. Being Asian, being Korean, and and usually I tell them, well, jokingly I say I had the fastest trills. So that way, I didn't know that I had such fast trills until I saw the trills. But how have you? Do you have something to say about that, Hyunji? Like, why did you start violin?
Well, my mom used to be a pianist, so it was very natural for me to being exposed music at a young age. So I first studied the violin with one of my mom's friends, who was a violinist. Um, but I think there are definitely some positive aspects from playing works from different cultures and by different composers from various backgrounds. Like, we hear so much Jesse Montgomery's works these days, for example, especially since the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it is great that lots of institutions and the groups introduce and propagate these works and composers from different backgrounds. And I believe that it can be really influential. But I recently, in my graduation recital, performed a solo violin piece called Contrast by Lee Sang-yoon, who's a German and Korean composer.
Sure.
But purely because I wanted to explore his music and the world. So on the other hand, I believe the music is not only about serving current social climate, but I think it needs its own space in our mind and heart to reach the beauty and the world that doesn't exist in this world. So as an individual artist, I think it is your freedom to choose what you want to convey through the work and even what you want to play. And for example, even if we play a piece by Robert Schumann, we are not actually learning like specifically the German language and the only, right? There's a part of aspect that we can learn about German music or the culture. But I believe that when people specialize in certain types of music or a composer, they fully dedicate their efforts. And I think that makes a deeper connection and understanding for the art's own sake. For example, under Schiff, when I hear Robert Levin talk about music or play, every time I hear them play and talk about it, I just appreciate so much. And then even from the previous forum when Miss Bian said that music has no boundaries, it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, which composer you play, in a way it shouldn't matter.
It's completely true. But I
It's
mean,
just my personal opinion.
yes, but I mean, but what we see in this country, and somehow the Asian, sort of our people have kind of taken the torch, right? I mean, to a point where so many Asian string players are now occupying seats in the U.S. orchestras. I mean, not only U.S. but in Europe, and I think there is a stigma that why are the Asians the torchbearers to this Western canon? Mai, do you have some insight that can you share with us?
Well, I feel like when I play for example, Japanese composers' pieces, I feel like I have a different dimension of understanding the depth of that composer because I can imagine what his life was like growing up and how he came to understand those poems and how he felt in how that's my puppy. She wants me to pet her, but yeah.
Yeah.
But when I was a senior in college, I was tackling to play the Shostakovich Sonata, and of course that's the last piece that he wrote, and but I felt very defeated at that moment because I'm not only that I haven't been to Russia, I'm not Russian. And I felt like, knowing that I told my professor, who was Chinese American, great violinist, great teacher, I told him that I feel a little bit defeated. No matter how hard I've worked, how hard I get to know this piece, I feel like I'm not going to be ever as good as a Russian person who know it inside out of Shostakovich would play. And then he sort of like, smiled at me and he gave me this book next lesson. And then that book was called Invisible Cities. And about this book, it's basically this guy travels all over the world with all this made up, people, made up language, made up food, made up cultures. But basically, what his message was that you can use your imagination. You can be anything, and you can love anything you want if you just imagine it from that person of perspective. And oftentimes now I tell my students, these are pieces that a human being wrote for human being, maybe for some cases for whales or whatever, but most likely it's like most humanly possible way of creating the arts, and us as a human should be able to really understand where that came from, how that came about, and how much effort that they put on the pen to leave this for whatever 100 years to the future. They had a message, and we're here as a human to pass it along to the next human.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so the prejudice that you're talking about, of course, I got a lot of it. For example, I came to here, and everybody just assumed that I studied Suzuki, right? But the truth is, I never heard of Suzuki method until I came here. So that was like I was like, "What's Suzuki method?" I had to learn all over there from the beginning, and things like that. It's like, it kind of makes you wonder why these things came to that person. One of the things that boils my blood even now is if we're talking to somebody, right? And if I pause even 1 second, they start going, "Do you understand what I'm saying?" They just assume that I didn't understand English. That happens all the time. And then I'm straight off like, yeah, I've been here for 29 years. I have American daughters. I have an American husband. Yes, I do understand what you're talking about. Just give me a second to come up with the right words to explain to you. But this conversation didn't have to be there if I was an Asian, I would say, and then also if I was something, just a human, that, for us to sort of deeply understand what Brahms must have gone through in his life and knowing deeply and those markings, it really speaks to you. It's not because I'm Japanese, it's because I'm a human, and that's not owned by any one particular people or the culture. Yes, sure, they might understand like the way that I understand Takemitsu.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that it's. I think Brahms or Beethoven would have been mad if it was categorized as it's our music. It's a world's music. It's not one particular thing. Nobody owns that.
Of course.
Yeah.
And
So I see what you're getting at, Jay. That's sort of, yeah. It is a kind of really racist.
right. I mean, not only that, but it would be like Lay, like if you created a new piece and you said you said the Shanghai Quartet plays it better than anyone else. We all know that's not. First of all,
That would be that would be defeating myself.
yes,
For a purpose.
right,
But it's also like it reflects a kind of ignorance of history. I'm thinking of we call this instrument. You're playing an instrument. What's an instrument? It's just a medium.
yes,
It's what you put in it that what matters, right? So I feel like if you just step back a little bit, like think about what we consider to be the national instruments of
right,
China. Let's say, we think about pipa. I'm sorry, pipa is an imported instrument. It's not a indigenous Chinese instrument.
right,
We talk about erhu again. Sorry, erhu is also from abroad. The dulcimer, that's from abroad. Like when we think about Japan, the biwa, these are all imported instruments. Yet over time they become national instruments for us. You know, so it's not going to be very unlikely that violin and piano can be our national instruments, just because the things that we put in that music would define what that instrument is capable of,
right,
right? That instrument expresses. So I think don't forget, it's just an instrument.
right. I mean, then it would be like saying, bluegrass can't be American because, it uses non-American instruments, and that is completely preposterous. And I mean, your point is well taken, especially, um, a composer who now lives here is American and writes Mongolian-inspired music. I mean, I think we encompass the entire circle of being a global citizen and being American. Um, I just wanted to just tie all this together, um, and talk about, like, being the human beings that we are, and as we lead some of this conversation and discourse about equality, especially being citizens of this country and what we need to do in order to at least start inching towards this real diversity and inclusion that we hope to achieve one day. Um, as musicians, can we help? Obviously, as a composer, Lei, you're writing works that mean to you and that speak to you with meanings and underlying tones and messages that you can, like with your opera, um, that you wrote about gun violence, for example, and immigration. Um, for those all of us, like what is do we have a responsibility as Asian American musicians, Asian musicians on a global scale in order to inch towards, building a better future for our children and the next generation? And what can we do? Can I ask you first, Hyunji, what you think about that?
Sure. Um, I mean, to briefly share my recent personal story, I was writing a statement about diversity, talking about how to bring um, people, the minority groups, to the field of music. But as I was writing this statement, I felt strange to just because I've been recently worried about my own security, just in daily life, and my friends and my colleagues, just because of everything happening. And unfortunately, I had to experience a couple of times just last month in Boston. I was being yelled at from the stranger because I was wearing a black mask. And I just instantly felt that it wasn't about the color of the mask I was wearing. And the issue was that I just did not know how to respond. And I just also really just wanted to avoid the situation. And it made me feel guilty for that, not being able to do anything.
Mm.
And also because I was just frightened. And so I know there are more severe events and crimes we hear on the news, but I do think it's in a way even more important to address these subtle acts and continue to talk about it. And even with the harmless stereotype or the generalization,
Mhm.
on a personal level, we have to maybe educate and talk about it with kids, if you have one. Otherwise, I think there is a tendency there has been also a tendency to sort of dismiss what we are actually going through a lot, besides those severe crimes. So I would like to learn how to speak up. I mean, this opportunity I really appreciate, because this is almost the first time I'm actually talking about my experience and what I've been thinking about this particular issue. Otherwise, I mean, just because I feel like it's really difficult to talk about it. And but then it doesn't mean that also means that I want to feel more support from not only from this closer community, but from broader community. So it's just my hope that although with too many victims, this issue is becoming more of a national issue, and I really do hope that this reach more people, and so that we can talk about this more often in a more serious way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mai, how do you think we can change the discourse?
Well, I read an article about this man who teaches at Mass Art, and he was African American, and he was stopped on the in JP, and he was just picking up a coffee, and he was stopped by two cop car, and they came and they questioned him for 40 minutes, and it was nothing to do with him, but just because somebody said it was a black man who stole somebody's purse, that he was, stopped. But he said what helped him, and it felt like he was kept thinking, okay, I'm gonna be shot, I'm gonna be killed here. He was panicking, but he said there was another African American woman across the street who stayed with him the whole time, then watched what was going on, and didn't leave. It's sort of giving him the emotional support that I'm here, I'm watching this, and this cannot go wrong for you. He said that was the most supported, felt better things about the whole event. And I am here for anybody who wants to talk about it. That's something that is really difficult for Asian culture. It's because there's a stigma.
Yes.
Going through counseling is bad because that is considered as you're crazy, right?
Sure.
And nobody goes through the counseling, but I feel like our culture needs the most counseling. Because we just bottle it up almost like, completely inside here. And all these compartmentalized things, it needs to be open at some point. And I'm here as a person to person who might understand deeply how that feels from inside, to be here for anybody to come up and talk about. Or I could just be a big listening ear, or I could also just be there literally if they feel some point that a little insecure to even walk home by themselves. In these days, it is very difficult. I have my car parked in a very small alley, and that last Wednesday, I really hesitated. Like, should I be going to my car by myself? But then I decided to sort of, have a flashlight and talk to my husband on the call, so I'm not alone. And that being that at that corner, I'm sure Hyunji, you felt alone. You couldn't do anything about it. If there was my husband right next to me, they wouldn't have said something like that, to start with. But if there was somebody else, they wouldn't do things like that. Or I'm there to sort of give the shoulder. I'm there to sort of understand they need a place to talk about it. So I'll ask those questions, and so that they can talk about it, they can express. And as they talk, their thoughts will be much more clearer. Why they're feeling this way, and it's okay to feel that way. And so as all of us who've been here long enough, we know what that is, to compartmentalize everything and hold it inside. That is very important, to sort of be the one to open their faucet so that they can let go of those pressured angers or whatever thoughts inside.
100%. And Lei, can you give us how do we culminate our courage, for a better future for your son, everyone else's children who are Asian American, Asians who come over to this country? How do we steer that needle to come to a point where it's a better future for all of us?
Yeah, it's complicated, and it does involve some challenging conversations that's going to be difficult. I was shielding my son. He's now 11, but just a few years ago, when the last president was elected, we encountered in a parking the parking lot. We're getting out of a restaurant, and yeah, somebody shouted at me, my wife, and my son, who was then 7 or 8, go back to China, right? And that my son at that time wouldn't understand what that meant, 7 or 8. But now, uh, he being 11, almost 12, he sees these things on TV. He's going to ask me these questions,
Yes.
and we have to be very, very honest and informative, and we can't hide these things. It's not about building a bubble around him to pretend everything's going to be okay. Are not safe. I mean, it was also about last week I started to feel I'd like to take a walk by myself on a trail or something like that. These days I do, not only myself feel a little bit anxious, but also my friends ask me, are you still taking those walks? How are you going to be sure you're going to be safe? Let alone if I take my son on these trails. But on the other hand, I have had these moments in my life that I feel like we're stronger than we think we are. Just we are here, you're here, every one of us here, and everyone who might be listening to this, each one of us is here, and I think the world is becoming a better place because we're here. We are doing what is right, and we are listening to each other, and that's oftentimes it's like Jay, you mentioned about diversity. We are actually a lot more diverse than how we present ourselves. Speaking of those
Most
music, for
definitely.
example, all the Asian students in the music school, yes, they tend to play a similar kind of music, but perhaps if they all think they have the right to bring their own stories into the music, into the programming, into the presentation, I think that is going to be a lot more diverse than we have right now. It's just simply that we are more diverse than we look like, when we look on stage. And that is probably true in every school I've been to and any place I've been to, and in my own department for sure. My colleagues, my students are so diverse, yet the work we do don't measure up, So there's a lot more we can do just simply by celebrating ourselves, celebrating each other, and just listen to each other and recognize each other as who they are. I think that already will just reveal who we are in a much more powerful way, and actually a lot more honest way. And I think that will be a good place to start.
Here, here. I want to thank you, all our panelists. You're an inspiration, and really the courage that you have to share your story, and especially in these difficult times. I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and this forum that's been available to us. NEC's Cultural Equity and Belonging Advisory Board that's been here to present these talks. I really want to thank, starting from President Andrea Kalin, Tom Novak, Nick Tatar, and Stanford Thompson. And of course, my special thanks goes out to Lisa Bauer, David Apostolides, and especially Emily Masters for bringing us together in the first place. And I hope that little bit of this conversation can move the needle somewhere, that we can all be in a better place a week from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, and that our art can matter and change those old ideas and the antiquated hate and prejudices that still plague this country and the world. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you to all again.
Thank you.
For
Thank you, Jay.
participating. Thank you guys. Have a great night.
Thank
Thank you.